Hello friends, welcome to Dr. Sai Physiology Academy, DOPA for short. This is the place where we make the learning of physiology easy, exciting, and effective. Thank you for joining me. And if you're new to this channel, you're especially welcome. And if you love the content that we share, kindly click the like button and also the subscribe button. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't get to miss any new content that we drop. Now let's get started. So we started with the adrenal gland in the last lecture, in the part 1, introducing the different zones of the adrenal cortex, knowing the fact that adrenal gland is divided into the cortex and then the medulla that secretes catecholamines, has similarities with the sympathetic function division of the ANS, autonomic nervous system. All right, so now the first zone, glomerulosa mineralocorticoids, deals with minerals, sodium, potassium, control. Okay, controls the levels, and the hormone there in charge is aldosterone. Now we're going to be dealing with glucocorticoids from the zona fasciculata, this green area. Okay, so the main hormone there, for 95% of glucocorticoid activity is carried out by cortisol, the hormone called cortisol. Okay. No, we talked about the synthetic pathway. They are all from cholesterol. Okay, the difference is just the enzymes involved that divert, from cholesterol, pregnenolone, progesterone, and so on, 11-deoxycorticosterone, that leads to, then there's a branching out with an enzyme that leads to the pathway cortisol, 11-deoxycortisol, then cortisol. Okay, so that's basically it. So now, what is the main function of cortisol? Just like aldosterone has a nickname, life-saving hormone, this one has its own nickname. It's called what? The stress hormone. Now, why is it called the stress hormone? Cortisol helps you to deal with stressful situations. Any situation, whether it's physical stress, mental stress, any situation, life situation that places demand on your mental and physical abilities and faculties, cortisol helps to be able to manage that. And this thing is very, very easy to understand, because we're going to be talking about the physiological functions as they affect various parts of the body, systems, and all of that. So stress, what do you think the body needs to manage stress? What do you think? Think about it for a minute. You find that energy, of course, you need energy. And what is the energy currency of the cell? ATP. How is ATP gotten? From biochemistry, the glycolytic pathway from glycolysis, coming from glucose, breaks down, pyruvate, enters the Krebs cycle that now enters the mitochondria and produces a lot of ATP, which drives chemical processes, physiological functions. Everything about the function of the body is chemical processes, and energy, ATP, drives all those chemical reactions and processes. But also remember a very important principle, underlying principle of physiology, that proteins are the structural and functional molecules of life, of the cell. So in conjunction with the demand for energy, okay, to manage stress, you also need proteins. Because enzymes that are catalyzing chemical reactions, they are proteins. So there is increased demand for synthesis of proteins, the use of proteins in managing stress. So if you forget any other thing, don't forget these two things. Glucose that produces energy, proteins catalyzes and helps manage different functions. Now, proteins bring about the different functions. Okay, so when you are now talking about the functions of cortisol, how cortisol acts, you will see that it wants to raise up the levels of glucose in the blood, increases the utilization of glucose, manufactures glucose, even from non-carbohydrate sources. Do you understand? So that is it. So what are the physiological functions? Now, how does it affect metabolic fuels, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates? Here is it. For carbohydrate, it increases glycogenolysis. Okay? It increases glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis, so that glucose will be more available. Okay? It also increases gluconeogenesis. So you see that it has some similarities with glucagon. Okay? Glucagon wants to increase glucose. So it's something similar, especially as it deals with carbohydrates. So, and so on, glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, and all of that. Then also, so this makes it diabetogenic. Diabetogenic, anything that increases blood levels of glucose, hyperglycemia. So it can cause hyperglycemia. These two things here, hyperglycemia. Okay, but because it wants to manage stress, you need glucose to increase the production of ATP. Then the second most important thing it does as it relates to proteins now. Proteins, it increases the breakdown of proteins, catabolism of proteins. In order to do what? You ask yourself, why is it breaking down proteins? Why? Because it needs to make available amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So it needs the availability of amino acids so that new proteins can be synthesized. You get it now? So it's just like a recycling mechanism. That you have old material, for example, an old car, and you want to make a new car. You now begin to dismantle that car, take some very important components, and I use it to manufacture a new car. So something like that, that's what it does. So it's breaking down old protein and releasing the amino acids to recombine it to form the necessary proteins that are required to carry out the functions and activities that will help you manage that stress better. You get it now? So that is it. Breakdown of proteins. Then fats, also very straightforward. Fats, breakdown of fat, lipolysis. Lipolysis. So another thing you need to understand about the function of cortisol, other systems. It's not just only metabolic fuels, it affects so many other things. One of them is the muscles. Muscles. What does it do? It also helps in the breakdown of the proteins in muscles. You see that? Because muscles are made up of proteins. So it breaks down the proteins that form muscles. So it reduces muscle bulk. That's why in excess of cortisol, for example, there's loss of muscle tissue and muscle weakness. Okay? So it breaks down. Okay? Then another aspect that is also strange is bones. It promotes osteoclastic activity. Promotes osteoclastic activity. And sometimes you are surprised. It promotes osteoclastic activity to release calcium into the bloodstream. But at the same time, it reduces the absorption of calcium in the intestine. You see that? So basically, it's, vitamin D promotes osteoclastic activity with parathormone, but at the same time, it also promotes mineralization. So some of all these things, they look antagonistic, but it's to help in balance. Because physiological functions, they function through opposing forces to bring about balance. So in bones, promotes the breakdown of bones to release calcium and all of that. So which means when there's excess of cortisol, there's loss of bone tissue, which is termed osteoporosis. We'll come to that. All right. So that is that for bones. Then what of other systems? For example, in the blood, it promotes erythropoiesis. Okay, it increases RBC, that's red blood cell production. It helps. Of course, in stressful situations, you need more oxygen, because oxygen is part of what you need in combination with glucose and all of that in the mitochondria to produce ATP. That means it will support anything that has to do with oxygen. So you see how logical it is. Very easy to understand. Okay, so it has a positive effect on RBC production. The same thing with, and also platelets. Platelets. But another funny thing is that it has a negative influence on the production of lymphocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Okay, so let's write it here. Negative for okay, so it has negative effect, and because of that, it suppresses the immune system, and also is anti-inflammatory, because these cells, these cell types, lymphocyte, basophils, they are the ones, they help in inflammation. They produce what is known as cytokines. 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 Okay. Inflammation has to do with tissue response to injury. Tissue response to injury. So it negates inflammation. Has a negative impact on inflammation. So it has anti-inflammatory activity, cortisol. Anti-inflammatory activity. So it's used to suppress both the immune system and also to suppress inflammation. Because of that, this thing. So the body knows what it's doing. In stressful situations, that's not when, because inflammation, one of the symptoms of inflammation is what? Generates a lot of heat. Okay? Part of all these cytokines, they lead to increased temperature. That's not what you want to manage stress. So you see why it negates inflammation. Okay, so in stressful situation, it doesn't want your body to be inflamed, doesn't want you to have high temperature, fever, and all of that. So it negates. So it's very easy to understand. Okay, it also has influence in the CNS, helps you to concentrate, because in a stressful situation, you need your mind to function excellently well. So when cortisol is lacking, you have a lot of mental disturbance. Inability to concentrate, sometimes even personality changes. Okay, so cortisol, basically the details are in the books. Okay, details are in the books. This is basically what you need to know about the functions of cortisol. So after the break, we're going to be learning about the regulation. How is the regulation? It's also a very easy stuff. Don't go anywhere after this break. All right, you're welcome back. So now we'll just talk briefly about regulation. Very straightforward. All right, so you know that there's the adrenal cortical hormones, especially glucocorticoids. they are under the influence of the pituitary hormone known as adrenocorticotropic hormone. Remember, I'm sure you remember that adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, from the anterior pituitary glands, corticotropes, synthesized from the corticotropes. But then you also have a higher one from where the hypothalamus, called corticotrophin releasing hormone, CRH. Okay, so everything about that, because of the complex, stress it's not simple mechanisms involving just regulation of levels of organic nutrients or minerals, and so on and so forth, aldosterone and insulin, all those kind of things, parathyroid hormone. Okay, those ones, they don't need the higher centers. But this one, because of the kind of stress, kind of mental stress, physical stress, is very diverse. It's not one simple substance is controlling. That's why it needs the involvement of the higher center in the brain. Now, let me tell you something very interesting, a secret. Do you know that in a 24-hour period, 75% of cortisol that is released in 24 hours is released between 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. Shocking, very surprising. 75% of it. 75% of the cortisol that is released in a whole day, released between 6 hours. Why? Because that's when people are just waking up. You are getting into the day, the business of the day. And that is why the most productive time in your whole day is around this period. Early morning when you wake up, between 4 a.m. 10 a.m. So you've understood how nature works now. So align yourself with nature. Don't joke with this period. That's where a lot of cortisol is released. And it starts from this. Okay? So the CROH is released more in this period of time. Because it follows the sleep-wake cycle. It's a brain stuff. Your brain, you have a biological clock. Okay? It's known as a circadian rhythm. Let's write it here. Or you call it a diurnal variation. That means it's not secreted the same throughout the day. There's a period where it's secreted a lot, and a period where it's secreted less. Controlled from the hypothalamus, the brain. The hypothalamus has a lot of input from higher centers, from all parts of the brain. And part of it is the control of daylight variation. So it knows that, yes, this is the daytime, early morning, daybreak. You need a lot of energy to go about your work. So through the CROH is released more during that time, and ACTH also follows the same pattern, which also influences the release of cortisol, synthesis and release of cortisol, that also follows the same diurnal circadian rhythm. Okay, so that's basically how it's controlled. It all starts from the hypothalamus, the corticotrophin releasing hormone. And of course, it works through a negative feedback mechanism. Cortisol is high, it can go through the long loop to inhibit further CROH release. But basically, what controls it is circadian rhythm. Okay, now let's briefly just touch on the disorders, the adrenal cortical hormones. The one that affects cortisol is called what? Cushing's syndrome. You should never forget it. Cushing's syndrome. What do we mean by Cushing's syndrome? It is excess secretion of cortisol. So it's as a result of there's a tumor in either the corticotropes in the pituitary gland that is now releasing a lot of ACTH that is stimulating cortisol release, or there's a tumor in the zona fasciculata itself releasing. So it can be primary from the adrenal gland or up there from secondary to a tumor in the pituitary gland. Okay, but basically, excess is excess. It yields the same very bad symptoms because of its influence in lipolysis, fat metabolism. You find out that there is a redistribution of fat. One of the symptoms of Cushing syndrome causes a redistribution of fat. So fat is distributed from the periphery, the extremities, and it moves to this center, to your trunk. So it leads to what we call a buffalo hump here, full of fat, and a moon face. Okay? Called moon face. Moon face. Moon face. And buffalo hump. Buffalo hump. Okay? Then another thing is that there's what is known as striae. Striae. Striae is just talking like stretch marks, okay, especially at this abdominal region because of the stretching. And one of the things that causes it is because you know your skin now is made up of a lot of collagen proteins. So as excess breaking down of protein now makes the skin thin. So there is easy bruising. Any small thing, there is bruising, and which also causes increased ability to have stretch marks. So you have a lot of striae, especially at the abdomen and so many other parts of the body. Excess cortisol. Okay, so basically that's you also have hyperglycemia. You know from the functions, you know all that. So another important symptom I need to know is osteoporosis. Osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is demineralization. Usually happens naturally in old people. But when you are a young person and you have excess cortisol, you have Cushing syndrome, there's osteoporosis. So there's a lot of demineralization of your bone. Your bones are brittle, can easily fracture. Osteoporosis. Another important thing you need to remember is immune suppression. Remember we talked about how it suppresses lymphocytes, eosinophils, and all of that inflammation. Causes immune suppression and increased susceptibility to infections. Okay, let's write it here. Number 4, immune, or we can just say immunosuppression. This is excess. Now, deficiency. Deficiency of cortisol. There's a syndrome called Addison's disease. Okay? So what does Addison's disease mean? It's actually a destruction of all the zones. So that means it will cause hypoaldosteronism because it's glomerulosa. Zonal glomerulosa have been destroyed. Zonal fasciculata have been destroyed. So there is lack of cortisol, and also reticularis has also been destroyed. Androgens are no longer there to be produced in sufficient quantities. So all the different, you can know all the symptoms that can result. Okay, so there is now hyponatremia and hyperkalemia because of its effects, aldosterone. Then because of your inability to manage stress, there's personality changes, there's a lot of inability to concentrate, okay, and all of that. You can't manage stress. In fact, you can even die when you are faced, especially when you are faced with stressful situations. You can break down if you are lacking cortisol. You see that? Then for the reticulars, it mainly affects females because males, from their testes, they produce androgens, testosterone, androstenedione. Okay, so males are not affected, but females, the androgens there, they are significant. So when it's lacking, you see that there's decreased pubic hairs and axillary hairs for females because there's decreased androgen production, but it doesn't really affect males. So basically that's just what you need to know about some of the disorders that can happen, excess and also deficiency of some of these hormones. All right, the details are in the books. You can check the description box. You see the link there to download some of these books. All right, so see you in the next video.